Welcome to the Minds Capital Podcast, the show devoted to the growing world of independent sponsors and entrepreneurial private equity. I'm Will Smith, here with my partners in Minds Capital, Nicholas James and Max Lummis. Today's conversation is with Ted Kramer of HKW. Nicholas, what was the takeaway that you had from our conversation with Ted?
So Ted is the CEO of HKW, which is a 123-year-old financial firm. It started out as a merchant bank. I think it's been an investment bank, and then it became a private equity fund. It's been through 5 funds, and now they operate as an independent sponsor. And so it's just interesting to hear his reflections and perspectives being at a firm with such a rich history. One thing he talked about their current operations was that they have at least 4 senior partners, and each of them owns a pillar. And he says they have 4 operational pillars: sourcing, transaction, operations, and exit. And so we stopped a little bit at this because I thought it was super interesting, because you'll often hear sponsors talk about how they're trying to balance, deal flow and operations. And so it's kind of a two-faced, you have 2 work streams that you need to balance at all times. But I think Ted points out that actually isn't sufficiently nuanced, because if you're focused on business development, you might be sourcing or you might be closing a deal. But it's hard to actually do both. Any searcher will tell you that. It's hard to do both at the same time. So by having one for each of those, you get a handover from the sourcing to the transaction person. And so that means the sourcing person can continue without being encumbered or distracted. Similarly, on the ops side, it's quite easy to get tangled in the weeds and be focused on here and now. But by having a partner dedicated to exits and always preparing the companies and having an eye and having conversations, it makes them very proactive to exiting their portfolio companies. And so I thought that was just a very smart way to set it up, and to have specific dedicated resources to all those 4 elements made a lot of sense to me.
One of the other topics that you'll hear us talk about is how HKW, after these 5 funds that you referred to, Nicholas, is now leaning back into the independent sponsor model. Usually we hear about sponsors trying to become traditional private equity blind pool funds, and here HKW is going in the other direction. And Ted cites the F word, flexibility, that we always hear is the great benefit of the independent sponsor model. But one of the weaknesses of the sponsor model is the certainty to close, or the perceived lack thereof. So, and of course, as we've heard so many times about the history of the label of the independent sponsors, starting out as fundless sponsors, and this was announcing that there was no money behind you, and how independent sponsors got wise to that and changed their name. But the point, the weakness remains that, especially if you're a first or second time sponsor and you don't have the track record, you don't have much to point to build credibility with your sellers, it's a problem. You don't have the same heft, or at least perceived heft, that a traditional private equity fund or more established independent sponsor would. Well, HKW, being a centenarian, 120 plus year old firm, just doesn't have that issue at all. I mean, this was actually a company during its investment banking days that took Texas Instruments public back in the 60s, I think. So Ted and HKW just get the have their cake and eat it too. They get the flexibility without any of the perceived inability to close. This is a 120 plus year old firm. So any owner they interact with they're going to have all kinds of credibility that they can indeed close. So just a reminder to sponsors that this weakness does exist. If you're a first or second timer, you're acutely aware of that. But the good news is that as you build a portfolio and a track record as a sponsor, that eventually you can push through this problem, and the certainty to close becomes a non-issue, as it is for Ted and his team. Max, what did you take away from our conversation with him?
A couple things. I'll piggyback on what both of you said, but I agree. That's still the stigma, I think, with newer independent sponsors, is just the perceived inability to close. And so I think that's just something that obviously it's got to be worked through. And I agree, as you move along in the process and you build up your reputation, that that starts to be less and less of an issue, but it's certainly a barrier for early independent sponsors that has to be figured out. And I think it probably takes hard work and a little bit of luck to get through that first deal. But going back to Nicholas, what you were talking about with the various work streams involved in the independent sponsor process, it's not just buying deals and selling or buying companies and selling companies. There's so much more to it. And I've actually been thinking about this a lot. And I think it kind of boils down to really three pillars or three kind of buckets of skill sets that are required for a modern independent sponsor team. It's not just a solo shop so often anymore, just because one person can't be a master of all these things. And I think it kind of breaks down into investment excellence and capital strategy. So that's everything from sourcing the deal, diligence on the deal, the structure, and then eventually thinking about and planning the exit, which Ted obviously talked about with the exit committee, which I think was a really interesting point. So you've got that first bucket, and then I think the second bucket is really commercial value creation, which is a completely different skill set. And now we're into growing revenue, marketing, winning customers, optimizing pricing, customer retention. This is completely different than what many deal professionals bring to independent sponsorship, folks that have been investment professionals or in private equity in the past. This is really more sales and marketing focused individuals on this second pillar. And so you've got the investment excellence and capital strategy, commercial value creation, and then you have operational execution. And with that, we're really dealing with managing people, improving operations, building teams. And again, this is a very different skill set, which is often, that's often the skill set of the existing management team. When the sponsor's buying the company and the management team is really strong and rolling equity, I think the sponsor is going to rely pretty heavily on that management team to bring that operational and execution excellence. But really, these are three different, totally different skill sets where, somebody who's great at doing a deal and putting a deal together really may not be the best person to manage people and build teams. And nor may they be great at doing marketing and the creative aspects of the business. So I think as the model matures, these sponsors have to have a team that can bring all of these pillars to bear on a deal to be successful. It's getting more and more competitive, and we're seeing that in many of the deals that we look at. I think that's the trend for sure.
Great. Thank you, Max. Well, before we turn to the interview with Ted, a reminder that here at Minds Capital, we invest equity into independent sponsor-led acquisitions. Our check size is $1 to $3 million per investment, and we average about a commitment per month. So if you are a sponsor raising equity for a platform acquisition, submit your deal to us at mindscapital.co. Or if you're interested in investing in Minds Capital as an LP, there is a pre-registration form on our website for investors. So if you're accredited or can become accredited, fill that form out to be kept in the loop on our future raises. Again, mindscapital.co. And here is the Minds Capital podcast interview with Ted Kramer of HKW. Enjoy. Welcome to the Minds Capital podcast, your connection to the growing world of independent sponsors and entrepreneurial private equity. We are your hosts, Will Smith and Nicholas James. Newly acquired and PE-owned companies are high-value targets. Hackers time their attacks when teams are distracted by the deal, exactly when a breach can stall operations, bleed cash, and blow the thesis. Enzo Technologies is your full-service IT MSP for post-close stability. They assess your target, surface the biggest risks in plain English, and give you a day 1 through 30 plan to cut exposure, prevent downtime, and even find cost takeouts like bloated telecom bills. Check out enzotechnologies.com, INZO, or email CEO Nick Akers directly at nick@enzotechnologies.com. Having acquired Enzo himself, Nick understands the challenges sponsors and searchers face when transitioning a business.
So make sure to tell him you're an independent sponsor and listener of the Minds Capital podcast. Nick at inzotechnologies.com.
HKW was founded in 1903, 123 years ago, as a bank. In 1982, they became an independent sponsor. And in 2001, they became a conventional PE fund. Ted Kramer has served as the CEO since 2014, finished deploying Fund 5, and recently moved the company back to the independent sponsor model. They've acquired 5 companies in the last 18 months, and now they're evaluating their options ahead. Ted Kramer, welcome to the Minds Capital podcast.
Hey, Will. Hey, Nicholas. Happy to be here. It's an interesting world we are in today within the private equity and independent sponsor market. So happy to give you how we in HKW are thinking about the small end of the middle market currently.
Great. Well, we look forward to it. And we'll start with that theme that I just touched on, Ted, about your direction from conventional fund to now kind of leaning back into the independent sponsor model. The sponsors we talk to are usually trying to go in the other direction. So how do you think about that?
Well, I think it's situational at the end of the day. I think, as you alluded to in the introduction, HKW was an investment bank. Then we were an independent sponsor, then a institutional fund for 5 funds. And now with where the current environment is, we're acting as an independent sponsor. I think a lot of it has to do with an alignment question with what the current market is. The current market for Hammond, Kennedy, Whitney, and a lot of other small end and middle market firms, a lot of fragmentation, a lot of capital, a lot of independent sponsors, a lot of more family offices being a lot more sophisticated. So as we and our partners at HKW, it's really a partnership, look at what's best for HKW as we've been able to adapt for 123 years as the industries continue to change. We think that having a great sourcing engine, institutionalization, the addition of Debraj Roy and Lawrence Lederer on our transaction team and our senior leadership team, we think having the flexibility of what an independent sponsor model provides a lot of strength for us at HKW. Others may have another answer to what fits their edge or their strength, but if you think of all the resilience of the firm and how the firm's been able to evolve over all these years and how the macro environment is, I don't view this as going backwards by any means. I think it's more of an alignment question of how everything is going with regards to the industry. Whether it's exits of our legacy businesses to predominantly founders that we invest in from a new partnership, new platform perspective.
Ted, it's been 5 conventional PE funds, right? You've just finished deploying Fund 5.
Correct. Technically 4. When we raised our first fund, it was 1982 to 01 when we went into the fundraising market. We converted that basically into a fund. So to be technical, we've raised funds 2, 3, 4, and 5. So 4 institutional funds.
Okay. So understanding that flexibility is probably the most cited appealing characteristic of the independent sponsor model. And we just heard you say the same, heard you use that word.
For sure.
But why now? The question would be, why now? After 5 funds, lots of years not doing the independent sponsor model, there must be something in the market that's drawing you back.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think HKW is interesting for a variety of reasons. There's a legacy piece. Hey, a lot of people think the history is neat, but we're not in the history business. We're in the create returns business. And you're only as good as your current team, is your current deal, your current meeting. It's the hockey in me and the intensity that the firm has. You can debate all models, fundless sponsor models, family office models, institutional fund businesses. I think the way HKW looks at it, because of the longevity and the ability to adapt and the resiliency, I think that where the market is and the level of sophistication of family offices and those willing to want to back independent sponsor type transactions and not necessarily be into a big GP blind pool fund. I think in the small end of the middle market changes how funds who've been around a long time, have a great reputation, have a high certainty of close, think about how they can get capital to maximize the benefit of the investors, the management teams that obviously own equity, and obviously the HKW, the full team at HKW. So it gives us a different perspective, I think, than folks that are spinning out of funds that may not have the legacy, may not have the worry that all the senior partners do about the longevity of the firm. So from an HKW perspective, I think that where the world is, delayed exits, bringing in Devraj and Lawrence to really be senior leaders in the firm and lead a transaction, and having the ability to raise capital separately, we think that model right now is a really solid model. And I think when you see a lot of large institutional funds begin to do this or raise SBICs, when you see large institutional LPs create new structures to support the independent sponsor model, I think those are just other signals of the strength of the IS or the independent sponsor model.
And so to be clear, what I think I heard you say there too was that one of the weaknesses, if you will, of the independent sponsor model is the perception by sellers, owners, of the certainty to close and whether or not you can get there.
Yeah.
But in the case of a long-standing firm with a great reputation, you don't have that concern. So you have the kind of best of both worlds, that flexibility and that certainty to close.
I think from an HKW perspective, that's all I can really speak to, and the legacy and the history of our firm. From Glenn Skolnick and the past leadership to the current leadership to Devraj Lawrence to the future leadership. I think the benefit of being old, again, not to make it a museum type speech, is the adaptability that HKW has been able to go through as a firm for over 100 years. Okay. They've evolved, we've evolved, and we've been successful. If you look at today, I think all that culminates is to say, hey, if Devraj, Lawrence, myself, Jim Snyder, other people in our firm say we can get these deals closed, I think the intermediary base and the owners or the founders that are working with the intermediaries believe us, because we've done over 180 transactions. We've operated in both sides. We have our LPs supporting us on these transactions, among others. So I think we're unique in that way, where a lot of the peers could be great investors, have great runway, are younger than me, all these things. But I think that's where the legacy of HKW has helped us be really active in the 5+ transactions that we've done, in the last 18 to 20 months.
Do you think you'll continue at that pace?
We like to think so. Of course, at some point, you're going to get too many companies, within the portfolio to manage all the resources and, to do a great job as the fiduciary to create, multiples of a return to your investing partners. But I think from a deal flow perspective and how we source opportunities around North America and have for 20 some odd years, I think we will keep at that pace. But the hesitation, of course, is at what point do you have to temper it a little bit just from total volume of companies?
Yeah.
From a Inc. perspective, we have 11 companies. No, we have 15 companies. 14 companies. And the whole exit market, which I think we'll talk about later, is really complex. And we're trying to, get companies sold and monies back to our, primary and secondary LPs from the fund perspective.
You mentioned HKW's uniqueness, its differentiation. One of the other things that we know about HKW is its focus on sourcing. Talk to us about sourcing and the importance that HKW puts on it more so than its peers.
Yeah, I think, it's a fair question. I appreciate the question. Let me put my sourcing hat on. I think, when I started sourcing in 2001, there weren't many small and middle market firms that had what I'll call as competitively advantaged sourcing professionals. And I'm not disrespecting anybody that sources, but there were probably 10 of us, 12 of us from Riverside to Gretchen Perkins, Jay Jester, Mark Jones, Brian Snyder. I can list them all, because we're good, friendly competitor friends who respect each other a lot. And I think we all learned a lot from each other. And I do think we all see the market differently than the transaction people. It's not that we see it better. It's not that we see it worse. It's just that we see it differently. I think we can see tones change with how investment banks are thinking about different, how they manage different processes. So for example, today, we don't have much success with larger investment banks, but they're really shortening up the buyers list. Everybody wants a proprietary deal. I get that. But I think, you start to see the shortening of the buyers list sooner. I think you get to see how the industry is changing when you're outside the walls of the office. I traveled 45 weeks a year for 20 some odd weeks, banging on doors, all that shoe leather. You get the feel of how the environment's going and how HKW can be competitively advantaged with how we source and how we partner with founders. I think today within sourcing, you've got a lot of AI tools and things that can make you work faster, smarter, but there is still a huge element to that. So how do I take what I just said into leading the firm? I think, hey, there's tons of sourcing people out there. I view it as within HKW being pushed forward by the fellow partners, honored, humbled, a lot of responsibility. And I was surprised. And I'm proud that they have the confidence in me in 2014. And Mike Foisey, I don't want to leave Mike out. Mike and I really co-run the firm. I view myself as an outdoor person. Mike's an indoor person. Devraj and Lawrence and Jim Snyder are certainly senior partners. As I kind of view it, we're a partnership. There's 3 or 4 decisions a year I need to make, quote, as the leader, but the firm's tenets and their culture has always been a partnership mentality. So if you frame it that way, and we have different pillars with regards to the organization, a sourcing pillar, a transaction pillar that, really Devraj and Lawrence have come in to, add a lot of discipline and pattern recognition and success there. Operations, and then exits, being proactive on our exits. If you've got the right team in place and you've got the right culture, and you have some honest conversations, you can really, grow the firm and have success.
Can we talk more about the 4 pillars here? You mentioned for a private equity firm like yours, sourcing, transaction, operations, and exit is how you break it down. And then you said a couple of minutes ago, you said that on the sourcing side, your experience is that you really get a feel for what works versus what doesn't work when you're out in the field, when you're out traveling. Now, of course, a lot of sourcing and business development today happens, as you say, remotely via email and from your computer and laptop at home. So what did you mean by that being in the field is so important? And can you just elaborate a little bit on that piece of it?
Sure. I'll answer your question on sourcing, then go back to the pillars. I think in the small and middle market, called me old school. At the end of the day, you're ultimately going to pick a firm or a partner that you feel you have some authentic relationship to. One of the best books I ever read was a book by Keith Ferrazzi, Never Eat Alone. And he talks about genuine, authentic relationships. That is not a term I coined. It's a term that I memorized. And I think technology can get you so far, and you can do email, and you can do AI, and you can do Zoom calls. But at the end of the day, I do think all things else equal, investment banks, intermediaries, business brokers, any referral source, and their client, again, HKW is founder owned. That human element has to matter with who they're going to partner with, especially if the founder is going to be a part of the business with the private equity firm or HKW going forward. I don't think you can mail in sourcing and be truly competitive advantage if you take all the human element out. I realize people may listen to this and completely disagree with me, and that's okay. Our model works and their model works. It's a belief that I have.
But I think in what you were saying there, networking is better when you're in person and on the ground, but there seemed also to be a learning element to being in the field. What do you think that was about then?
I mean, I think when you're out, I think anything when you're out mixing up elbows or standing in people, you always hear things. You always talk about things. You always observe things that I think, Zoom calls and other things you can't necessarily pick up, because if you look at this call now, we're on 3 boxes and we got our things, and we're all in different environments. I just think it's easier to create a proprietary or more of a trustworthy relationship when you actually are physically together over years. We've called on our intermediaries and our relationships for 20, 25 years. Most of those are in person. Hey, the world did change when COVID showed up. I'm not disagreeing with you at all. We do Zoom calls and this, that, and the other. But, I think through the years, the trust that HKW has been able to build up helps us get some of the benefit of the doubt. Now, on the flip side, if we did not use the AI tools and did not do market mapping and did not do some direct reach out, I think we would be falling behind if we're just leaning on, trustworthy relationships all the time. I just don't think you can not consider that as part of a successful sourcing strategy.
Independent sponsors need a legal team that understands the model and knows the players. Platt Richmond, a Dallas-based boutique law firm, has deep experience in guiding independent sponsors through the complexities of their acquisitions. The team at Platt Richmond provides support on all aspects of your transaction, from structuring and diligence to financing and securities compliance. They also represent stakeholders throughout the ecosystem: capital providers, lenders, family offices, sellers, management teams, which gives them a unique 360-degree perspective on the sponsor model that ensures a seamless process for your transaction. Partner with Platt Richmond to focus on what you do best: finding and executing great deals. Visit plattrichmond.com today to learn more. That's Platt with 2 T's, Platt, Richmond.com.
And what specifically did you mean about market mapping there?
Market mapping? Yeah, I think, that gets into how the HKW's evolved. So, when Mike and I and the fellow partners, when we went through succession planning in 2014, I would describe HKW as an industry agnostic firm. And I think, hey, anything at that time between, say, 3 and 30 in EBITDA, I was reviewing, executing CAs, and, if a few knockout questions weren't there, we were bringing all kinds of offering memorandums in, from large, medium, small, and, lone wolf intermediaries. I think as you go through the funds that we went through and you look at pattern recognition, where you did good, where you didn't do good, where you need to lean in, you look at the competitive dynamics of new funds or independent sponsors or family offices that come out, they were all beginning to get more thematic, could understand how risks work within 1 or 2 sectors or themes versus 10. And the firm went through a lot of hard conversations. Devraj and Lawrence, have been great on getting us more pointed and more thematic, where they've been successful prior to joining us, but also where we have been successful. And I think, just like an athlete, I'm an ex-hockey player. I know how to score on goalies. That does not make me know how to play goalie. And it may be a cheesy analogy, but I think that works too within where the private equity industry is going, especially the level of expectations any investor has: family office, independent sponsor investor, institutional GP, formal fund investor. I think it's just a signal of the maturation and the competitiveness of investing in small private companies, regardless of where your capital comes from.
And so you think, as private equity has evolved and HKW has evolved with it, it's become more competitive, obviously. And since it's more competitive, you need to be better. And the best way to be better is to leave the industry agnostic approach behind and become more thematic, as you position it.
I think yes, for again, how HKW is structured and how we view the market in our history. I think that there are smaller independent sponsors that have been successful that may not want to do 5 investments in 18 months, that have a different model of sourcing, a different model of operational wherewithal, that they can manage to stay out and be a little more industry agnostic. Firms, there are still plenty of institutional funds that are industry agnostic. But again, as we looked at HKW, we looked at how we needed to adapt, we looked at, some honest feedback or results, we have evolved into looking and uncovering investment opportunities in the areas that we think are more thematic, and obviously where all of us have done well in historically and going into the future.
And specifically, what do you do when you do scope out the new market and this market mapping exercise? How do you guys identify and verify a new theme?
It's a good question. I think obviously one is, hey, where did your returns come from? How many investments did you make in those businesses? And how do they overlay within, macro ideas or macro themes within the world or within the investing world right now? So you've looked at a lot of picks and shovels and data center, utility, power infrastructure. We have 5 or 6 investments that have done very well in those spaces. And we think that because of that identified experience back from the independent sponsor days through the fund area, and where the world is going, we play well into that space. We have identified experience. If you look at telematics, IoT, security product, hardware security product businesses, you can look at Gatekeeper, Mobile Technologies, again, other platform portfolio companies where we've done very well in. We think there's a lot of fragmentation in all these businesses, a lot of founder-owned businesses. Hey, and they're not as choppy, or cyclical as some of our other investments have been. And I can go on, but there's 3 or 4 themes. So you do, it's kind of a consulting project, gather the information, see where the gap is, analyze what patterns you've seen through your 25,000 deals in our database, or more importantly, the deals that we've done well in, and the ones that we've offered indications of interest in or letter of intent, et cetera. And then you can begin to back into where you think, again, where the world is and how does HKW adapt to be successful with regards to partnering with founder-owned companies. But Nicholas, that's a good question. A lot of people want direct deals and they're using Grata and they're doing all these things, and we do too. But at the end of the day, I know you're only looking for 1 transaction or 2 from these directly negotiated proprietary opportunities. But it really is very hard. A lot of these companies you may have to interact with for 2 or 3 years. Luke Johnson does great at it. We do well at it. A lot of other firms do well at it. But to me, it's just one leg on the stool of how to find investment opportunities, regardless of what model HKW is operating under.
And so going back to the theme of sourcing, Ted, and having you as as CEO who came up through sourcing, what does that look like inside HKW today?
Good question. And I think we're all sourcing people deep down. I think, I was tasked with that pillar to get to Nicholas's question from a few minutes ago. But we're all sourcing. My fabric is this: we're all in sales every day we wake up. We may not think we are, but a dentist is a salesperson, because if they can't sell, they have no patience. Same with lawyers, same with the 3 of us on the phone. So my fabric just frames it that way. And I think sourcing, and how does it trickle down? Hey, I'm a sourcing partner and worry about sourcing a ton, regardless of the title that I have. Obviously, there's a lot of leadership capability, but as I alluded to at the beginning, we're really a partnership. Lawrence, Devraj, and I, Mike Foisey, Jim Snyder, we are, the senior leadership, and each person is responsible for one of the pillars and manages that accordingly. Devraj and Lawrence, when they joined, certainly have a big senior leadership in helping the guidance of the firm with where we invest, a lot of the themes, a lot of the things like that as well.
Let me ask on that, because normally you see private equity is divided into deals and ops.
Yep.
But you actually subdivided each of those into sourcing and transaction, and then operations and exit. And so having dedicated resources for exit in particular, but also transaction, that enables you as a sourcing person to just always focus on the next deal, right?
It does very much. And, when the prior Glenn Skolnick and Roy Whitney and Jeff Wood, the prior leadership, I reference their name because they've done a great job and are big mentors of mine. And when I was coming up and, VP of sourcing, they wanted to, and maybe because we're all athletes, they wanted to make it siloed out. The original thought was, when sourcing was the first pillar, was, well, deal transaction professionals historically, again, we started in 82, right? So the industry's changed a ton. They'd market, then they'd find a business, then they'd get it under letter of intent, then they'd close on it. then they'd have their board meeting, and then they say, oh, geez, we got to go refill the pipeline. So then they go refill the pipeline and they do it again. And if the deal broke up, they'd have to start over. So what, from a sourcing perspective, they wanted to have a constancy wide funnel where if one deal broke down, they'd have 20 others to pick from and have more of a production of how we could be more disciplined, less emotional, have optionality, and just find add-ons. And again, it didn't matter where the capital was coming from. That was just their belief. We then thought that the transaction people, obviously, are founders of many firms, obviously are hugely important within a private equity firm. Don't need to say anything really more than that. But if they're working on deals, they may not be operators like operating partners that have worried about payroll, have had to shut down plants, have integrated a bunch of add-ons. A lot of PE firms do this wonderfully well. But from an HKW perspective, it's how the prior leadership wanted. So we brought in, senior level CEOs of our prior portfolio companies to really build out that operational arm. The exit committee was something that in 2014 that we implemented just to be proactive in our exits. I think as we got more institutionalized from a fund perspective, we didn't want to be, quote, as reactive on our exits and be more proactive. And for us, and the way our culture works and accountability is the deal partners have to go through an investment committee to get a deal approved. The partners wanted to have an exit committee to find some way to hold their chairman accountable or to have a proactive way to sell and exit our companies as a firm and a partnership. And obviously some of that came through some lessons learned through our exit process. And then the transaction pillar is really, the transaction pillar is central to the firm, obviously, because I blend into the transaction pillar from sourcing. Ops blends into the transaction pillar, from due diligence, then transaction and operations, if you will, you want to frame it like that, go into the company post-closing to work on, the HKW playbook and to help, executing the investment thesis for our investors and the management team and ourselves.
What do you mean about being proactive with exits? Because in my world, you either exit because the board decided it's time to go to market, or you exit because you did get an offer in unsolicited that was too good to refuse.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anything more to it than that?
Yeah, I really do. And I think those cuts, whether, I think the independent sponsor companies that Lawrence and Debraj, the 5 that they've done in 18 months will play into this as well. I think if you frame it, you've got a fiduciary duty to your investor. It really takes out whether or not you're an institutional fund or not. So just set that aside. And I think the elongated long periods are impacted both by traditional funds, fundless sponsors, and family offices. So historically, the buy, build, sell would be the fund way of thinking about it. The family office or independent sponsor model may be more buy, build, hold. But I think at some points they're starting to merge a little bit. And I think when we would have these exit committee meetings, Nicholas, I would walk in and say, why are we not selling now? And one of the partners would look at me and say, well, Ted, we just partnered with the team 6 months ago. What do you mean by that? And I'm like, well, what are we doing to make sure all the 5 or 6 things that we've set in investment thesis are beginning to get executed? And there is a time, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or 7 years, where the compounding may slow, where the management team may come to you and say it's time. Or, hey, being respectful to, again, the investors who we view as the biggest fiduciary, that they may obviously want their return back. And I just think being sharp and being proactive on having the company more exit ready. Also, because the intensity and the akidi in my soul is always better to have the company ready for exit than need to do 4 or 5 things and be reactionary toward it. So, Nicholas, you can get that preemptive offer, or you can see if the winds change within the industry and you don't want to take a cycle again. You can have that company a little bit more on its toes and make it more sellable. And I think that's regardless of a fund or an independent sponsor or family office approach.
So Ted, it's about the company, the portfolio company being prepared for a sale, kind of in a perpetual state of being prepared, as opposed to more actively taking your portcos to market necessarily.
Yeah, in actuality, I think it takes HKW and our peers, regardless of, again, 36 months plus or minus to implement 80 to 90% of the playbook that, one's investment thesis may lay out on how to grow and improve, the partnership company investment.
And you said there that the independent sponsor model you feel like is more buy, build, hold versus the blind pool, traditional private equity is buy, build, sell. So for you, independent sponsors have a longer hold period, sort of in the spirit of independent sponsorship. Say more about your observation there.
Yeah, I just think when you look at the institutional fund business before COVID and, everything's coming out and it'll evolve and unfold and exits will begin to occur and this, that, and the other. But I just genuinely think that institutional fund firms, you partner with a business, you've got 36 to 48 months to implement the playbook, and then you look to exit that business. Why? Well, you need to start recycling money back to your LPs, presumably to raise your next fund. I think that that was historically how it went. Obviously, some companies will go sooner, some would go later, but overall, HKW's average hold period in the fund environment was 4.67 years. It's elongated now because of all the companies coming out of COVID and just the way the macro market works. You get into the fundless sponsor into family office, independent sponsor business. Hey, some companies can be held forever by family offices. I get it. I understand it. And, God bless them. It's the right move. Independent sponsors, a lot of those individuals that are starting those may want to have a fund. They may want to continue to be an independent sponsor. But if the fiduciary of the firm is the investor, you've got to get money back so they can recycle. At some point, those investors are going to have a return on their business. It may not be 4.67 years. It could be 6 or 7 years. But at some point, they will want to return. But I do think it's more of a hold mentality than it's sometimes the PE reputation of quick flippers or this, that, and the other.
Well, where this is a kind of a side effect of the flexibility of the independent sponsor model, because there aren't external demands related to the fund broadly. Each individual investment stands on its own, and if it means holding longer, that's fine. And so as a group, independent sponsor acquired holdings end up in the being held longer.
And I think you see that in the secondary market. In the fund business, you've got LPs want their money back. So there's a lot of good companies that are going into the CVs, if you will. And, some of the GPs are holding on to those through another transaction, and allows some of the LPs to get the money out of those transactions. We're not here to talk about that, but I think you see that, which does play in a little bit longer hold periods, at least through my lens.
You just mentioned secondaries, Ted.
Yeah.
And we know from the pre-call that you've actually have in some of your funds a very high concentration of secondary investors. Can you talk to us about that trend that you're seeing?
Sure. So in Fund 4 and Fund 5, we do have a lot of secondary investors that have come in over the last 2 or 3 years. I think when COVID got through it and companies started to go up and down and the average hold periods were increasing, I think a lot of limited partners were selling just blocks of their small and middle market PE or GP investments or what have you. So through that, HKW did get some secondary investors, and it gets into the exit question. Many of them are okay with the elongated hold periods to create their returns. They're not maybe as intense or concerned about holding on companies longer, as long as that value continues to increase, than what some of the primary LPs or it's very complex. I think a lot of the news articles that are out there try to make it simple and understand that, hey, are these quote zombie funds just collecting fees and doing this, that, and the other? I would say from an HKW perspective, absolutely not. We've been active in the market. We're not sitting still. We're growing as a firm, and we're growing our unrealized companies. And I just think, again, it's complex and it's situational, and you not necessarily can, just throw all these different funds in one bucket and say that this is who they are.
When you talk about it being complex, what do you mean? Do you mean having GP primaries and secondaries in a single fund and the kind of differing incentives they have being complex, or what?
Well, I just think, I think if you get 10 small and middle market funds and you look at their unrealized and realized investments, if you look at the different sectors that they're in, if you look at how many Roman numerals they have within their private equity fund history, if you look at their team, if you look at the evolution of where they've gone, just selling a block of companies to say, hey, we're getting all of our exits done, there's a lot more nuances behind it. And I think that when you have a lot of one-on-one conversations, LPs want the highest return as long as those companies are building value. If they're not building value, then hey, that's a whole nother question. So my point is, when I read articles about zombie funds in the industry, I am sure that there are some, but I am also sure, HKW being included, that we are increasing value of all of our companies. We are active in the market closing new transactions, and we should not be described under that umbrella.
You mentioned that you have 25,000 deals in your database and that you use this database for market mapping and for forming new themes for new investments. What else could you potentially use such a database for?
Yeah, and those 25,000 deals come from 22 years of sourcing. So when I got into the sourcing role, the partners, I think it was a senior associate or VP at that time, and the partners wanted sourcing to be a competitive advantage. So we were able to build a big customized CRM system that allowed us to manage and tier all the different intermediaries and referral sources. So if I'm traveling 45 weeks a year to all kinds of, primary, secondary, and tertiary communities in the country, I at least had a way to cover those cities in a very highly efficient and high return, kind of a way. Obviously, we tracked all of our deal flow. So, for example, we know how we do in different parts of the country. We know the different average purchase price multiples by subsector, by EBITDA range, by tier of intermediary, whether it's, 2 or 3 person firm, 4 to 8 person firm, big city, small city, single office, multiple office. So when you get all this data, I'm a BD person, but I can be, I'm a stickler, if you will, on data integrity. So it's garbage in, garbage out. And after time, years, decades, you can use this data to figure out where your new uniqueness is, where your edge is. Deb, Raj, and Lawrence come in. We all look at it. And that's why we think we're a little bit more institutionalized, faster, better, stronger. And again, regardless of where the capital come from. So you can begin to use that data to make strategic decisions versus having all these deals, not going through and having a dedicated person input these, knowing it's a slog, knowing it takes time, knowing it's mundane. But if you build it, you can use it at a senior level with all the senior partners to figure out where HKW can adapt, excel, and grow.
Yeah, I have to imagine you develop a nose for value also when you have so many reps in the deal management system, and you see what works and what doesn't, which kind of intermediaries tend to give us a higher ROI on our time in terms of deals materializing versus not, which kind of locations and states do we see more traction in. Are there any non-obvious conclusions that you have access to or that you know about in today's current climate based on the data and your experience?
I think from an HKW perspective, and again, founder owned 3 to 30, I'll say that way too many times just to remind your audience of what we focus on. A lot of our transactions and a lot of our returns have come from intermediaries in secondary and tertiary communities. So 75% of our deals that close come from those intermediaries in those markets. Doesn't mean the company is located in that market. It means the intermediary or the investment bank comes from that market. However, have we been successful with Houlihan Lokey? Yes. Have we been successful with Lincoln Partners? Yes. Much larger investment banks? Absolutely. Because even they at times will have opportunities that fit the independent sponsor program and model on the way they view value or value creation after closing, or hey, the owner just likes the partner and they just happen to be an independent sponsor. So, but having that data in a highly organized way as a CRM, I think, has helped HKW remain active and find opportunities when it's really hard to find closings.
And remain active you have, with 5 closings in 18 months. How do you even undertake so many new platforms in such a short amount of time?
Well, I think it's a good question. I don't take much credit myself. The credit should go to, Debraj Lawrence and Mike Foisey and, Jake Luker and Alex Johnson, really the deal teams, and Ken Robinson on how they go about managing due diligence, managing the investor raises within independent sponsors and the partners that we have, and really, finding the different pattern recognitions that we have, that when these opportunities come in, that we can jump on them and work our way through, the process, whether large or small, mostly small in our minds, and get these deals closed.
But from a fundraising perspective, for instance, you do 5 fundraisers in 18 months. I have to imagine your list of investors, it's not like you have 5 different lists that you went to here. So how do you manage not flooding them with too many deals? And if you have multiple deals at the same time, do you go to the same investors and kind of weigh one investment is better over the other? Or how do you manage those kind of conversations?
Yeah, looking at the lens that you just asked, a lot of our current LPs, either through their SBIC funds or other pockets of money, have supported HKW management on these 5 companies. We also have a network of individuals and families, and obviously ourselves. We're heavy into these transactions as partners, that have allowed us to have that high certainty of close. And I think it gets back a little bit to the beginning of our conversation, where I'm not here to give you a history museum and we're just some old legacy New York-based firm, but having the firm be able to adapt, caring about your relationships, being able to maintain them and produce returns historically to those folks that are supporting you now makes it has allowed us, to be active and get these deals transacted.
And talking about returns, you mentioned earlier in our call here that you've seen large funds establish SBICs, large LPs structure IS or independent sponsor vehicles. And so there's a flood of capital coming into the independent sponsor market. Is this driven solely by the promise of good returns? And if so, what are the returns do you think that they are targeting?
It's a good question. I'm not an LP, but I'll answer it through my lens. I think that the LPs and larger funds that are starting to drift down into the small end of the middle market again just see that arbitrage opportunity, which, Nicholas, as you would know, creates some higher returns. They see the fragmentation of the owners and just sheer volume of companies. When we were fundraising, one placement agent would always say, Ted, 97% of the money goes to 3% of the firms, and 3% of the money goes to 97% of the firms. Who knows if those numbers were accurate? Let's call it 80-20, 20-80. It's still huge. The point is that the level of fragmentation with regards to the number of opportunities for the small end of the middle market that doesn't get that many dollars in the institutional world back then provides a lot of opportunity. And I think as funds get into more thematics and more, I want to own this space, if they want to see continued deal flow, if we were in that bucket, I think the 3 of us would agree if we have to go down and get into some smaller founder-owned businesses to own that thesis, then we probably would do that. And I think you see some of that as well.
Ted, we have you for just another minute. Wanted to ask about SBICs. We've, of course, heard you mention them, but you were thinking about HKW standing up an SBIC. Were you not? How do you think about that from where you sit?
Yeah, before I joined HKW, I'd worked at an SBIC in Indianapolis, so I'm familiar with the model. When I was young and participated in some transactions there before joining HKW. I think the SBIC model is a wonderful model. I think it's additive to a lot of firms, and I think it can be additive to HKW with regards to how we try to remain flexible and aligned with finding small and middle market companies. I'm not trying to give you a non-answer, but we've got a lot to think about as a firm, as a partnership. Do we do an institutional fund? We're having success as an independent sponsor. We're getting support. The companies are doing well, and then the SBIC is additive. I don't think it's not would not take us out of doing independent sponsors. One could argue it's just complementary and allows us to still have some flexibility and alignment with how we view the current state of the market.
Can you give us a little bit more color on the things that draw you to standing up an SBIC and then the reasons why you might not?
I think from an SBIC perspective, the program and the government and the way it works to support founders across the United States is just a really neat tool to be able to grow entrepreneurial businesses. It may sound hokey, but that's the intent of the program. And I think there's an overlap with a lot of the size of opportunities that HKW seeks that provides that capital. I think also that it opens up HKW and other firms considering an SBIC to a new audience group of limited partners within the Community Reinvestment Act and SBICs within banks and lending institutions, allows you to increase your investor base. And I think from a returns perspective, I think when you are able to use the government as capital, that you can increase whatever type of returns there is, you can increase those returns for all involved. I don't think it changes who we are or changes our criteria or anything like that. A reason not to do it, the partners just decide we like the independent sponsor model and want to stay there, or consider just going back into traditional fund. I think these are not Ted H. Kramer decisions. These are, full partner decisions on how we decide the future of our firm. But I do think at the end of the day, I think the private equity industry is changing. I think family offices are a lot more sophisticated. I think that the independent sponsors have just, like the three of us, a lot of institutional, smart investors that have relationships and capability to do their own independent sponsor transactions. And the independent sponsor, if you want to scale, you can probably scale being an independent sponsor. If you don't want to scale and just want to do more buy, build, hold, Nicholas and Will that we kind of talked about, that allows you to do that. Being in an institutional fund, the clock's ticking. You've got equity outlay goals per year, so you don't fall behind on equity pacing. So you can try to get ready to raise that next Roman numeral. And I think the founders, most importantly, are more open to different vehicles of transacting than they were 10 years ago. I do think certainty of close is huge. I always will. It's human nature. If you're selling your baby, your company, creating all the, financial security, generational wealth, whatever, you want to know that, hey, HKW is a good firm, but you also want to know they're going to show up and have the wire ready. And I don't know how you get around that one from a decision matrix, from a seller or a future partner.
Well, Ted, we thank you for coming and sharing on the Minds Capital podcast. We hope that you guys, for deal number 6 here in your independent sponsor model, will consider Minds Capital as an LP. We'd love to be able to see that.
We will continue to call. So we've got 3 site visits upcoming. So we'll stay tuned.
Super. Ted Kramer, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Have a good day.
Hope you enjoyed that interview. For more like it, subscribe to the Minds Capital podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also watch us on YouTube. Also, check out Minds Capital, where Nicholas and I are partners alongside Max Lummis. We invest equity in independent sponsor deals. So if you're a sponsor with a deal under LOI, please visit mindscapital.co to start a conversation. There's also an investor tab on our website with information about future fundraisers. See you in the next episode.